Hello Year 8 and welcome to today's lesson. Today we're continuing to look at the transatlantic slave trade and we are still looking at abolition, but we're not going to look at how slavery was abolished. Now we're going to start looking at the effect of abolishing slavery in the British Empire. So today we're asking this question: to what extent did the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 end slavery? I'm going to explore the question in a minute. Now, for this lesson, you need the sheet that I've attached to ePraise, either printed out or just so that you can read it. You need a ruler to track your reading, something to write with, possibly a highlighter, and in this case you are also going to need something to write on, so your exercise book or a piece of paper. I'm going to put mine up on the screen because I'm going to ask you to make a table in a minute. So let's go back to our question. To what extent did the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 end slavery? The first thing that I want us to do is just to pick it apart so we know what we're actually asking. Now I'm trying desperately to find the highlighter function. I can't, so I'll just do it with my mouse. So if we say to what extent, we're essentially saying how much or how far. So how far or how much did the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 end slavery? And when we talk about an act, you'll see it at the top of your reading sheets. An act is a written law. So this is the law that was introduced, funnily enough, in 1833, which abolished slavery. The slave trade was already abolished; it had been abolished in 1807. So this question is saying, did the Slavery Abolition Act actually end slavery? And if it did, to what extent did it end slavery? Now, in order for us to answer this question, we need to go back to something that we looked at right at the beginning of this topic before lockdown. It probably seems like ages ago, which is this definition. What is a slave? And it says redraft on there purely because I nicked it from that previous lesson, so I'll probably get rid of it by the time you've looked at your sheets. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause the video and then write down in this box your definition of a slave. Okay, I'm going to cheat a little bit and do a here's one I made earlier. And my definition is someone who is forced to obey someone else without question. I've even put a note for myself down here. Emphasis that it's not about being paid. You can be paid and still be considered a slave. It's all to do with having to follow instructions and not being able to question it. Now, whenever I teach this, I then always get one person who's either thinking or asks me, "Oh, miss, does that make me a slave?" No, it doesn't. If you were in one of my lessons and I asked you to do something, you could choose not to do it. If you chose not to do it, you'd probably end up in reflection. But you are still free to make that choice. It isn't a choice between life and death, whether you obey my instructions. So, obeying without question, so basically they have to obey in order to survive, is what makes somebody a slave in this case. So, when we ask this question, to what extent did the act end slavery, we're talking about the extent to which the act ended these people having to obey other people, or they would die, or they would slowly die if they weren't directly killed. And that's what we're going to look at now. So have your reading in front of you, have a ruler that you can use to track the reading, and then you can read through it with me. Now before we do that, we're just going to go through our keywords. So we've already looked at an act, which is a written law. An apprentice is a person who learns a trade from their employer. So for example, you might have an apprentice carpenter who works with an experienced carpenter for a certain number of years. They earn money, but they also learn a trade during that time. Former, having previously been something. I am a former student. I was a student, but I'm not one anymore. Bondage is the state of being a slave. Excuse me. Compensation is money or property which is given to somebody when they have lost something or when they have been injured. So you might see a lot of adverts on TV talking about compensation if people have been involved in an accident. And poverty is not having access to resources to meet your own needs. Okay, so now we're going to read through the reading together. So have this in front of you, have something to track the reading. Okay. In August 1833, the British government passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which officially freed over 800,000 people throughout the British Empire. However, two key questions remained. What happened to these people after they were no longer officially slaves, and what happened to thousands of other people who remained enslaved in other countries? All enslaved people under the age of 6 were freed under the 1833 Act. All other enslaved people would eventually be free. However, this freedom would only come after former slaves had worked as apprentices for up to 6 years, during which they would work for their former masters without pay and could be violently punished by representatives of the government if they did not obey orders or work hard enough. Many abolitionists argued that this system was unfair and campaigned for it to be abandoned. Apprenticeships for former slaves were eventually stopped early in 1838, and after that point, all former slaves in the British Empire were freed. Before we move on to the next paragraph, I want you to think about this section here. When these former slaves worked as apprentices, how far does that fit in with our definition of what makes someone a slave? Okay. The vast majority of enslaved people who were freed in 1833 had spent their entire lives in bondage without access to education, basic freedoms, and a good quality of life. After they were freed, it was slave owners who received compensation from the British government. The government used 40% of the money it would normally use in a year to pay slave owners compensation according to the number of slaves they had owned. Lord Harewood, who was already extremely wealthy and who had owned actually 1,277 enslaved people, received roughly £26,000 from the British government. That equates to over £1 million today. Freed former slaves received nothing, and for most of them, working their way out of poverty was almost impossible. Most high-quality farmland on former slave colonies was owned by plantation owners. Most former slaves had the options of either working on plantations for barely any pay or working poor-quality land which would barely make them enough money to survive. So again, I want you to think about this definition of what makes someone a slave and what we said earlier about this idea of needing to obey in order to survive and how that fits into the options for many formerly enslaved people after abolition. Britain also had a significant impact on countries which continued to support slavery. On the one hand, British abolitionists passionately campaigned for other countries to abolish slavery. However, on the other hand, Britain continued to benefit hugely from slave-grown goods. The Industrial Revolution, in which the growth of factories generated a huge amount of wealth for British people, was built on the creation of cloth from cotton in factories like this one here. The majority of the cotton which was used in these factories was grown by enslaved people working on plantations in the south of the USA. This trade continued well into the late 19th century when slavery was officially abolished in the United States. It was abolished in 1865, but actually a lot of the problems that we see up here occurred in the USA after that date. Okay. So, we're going to return to this question that we looked at the beginning of the lesson. To what extent did the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 end slavery? So this to what extent is essentially how far. The Act is that law in 1833, and slavery is the state of having to obey orders without question, or obey orders in order to survive. obey orders without question. Or in order to survive. Now, there we go. We're not going to move on to this question yet, because this section yet. I want to do a little bit of thinking first. And in order to answer this question, what we need to do is we, first of all, need to check our understanding, and then we need to unpick our arguments. So what I want everyone to do now is to pause the video, and then I want you to complete the quiz that I've included on ePraise. Okay, so once you've completed that quiz, I then want you to draw this table, either in your exercise books or on a piece of paper. It doesn't necessarily matter. Once you've drawn that table, you're going to go through the article that we've just read, and I want you to write down possible reasons from the article that we could use to argue that slavery did end completely, and possible arguments that we could use to argue that slavery didn't end at all. So I'm going to give you your first point, and I'm going to show you where we get it from. So if we take this second paragraph in, this is kind of our introduction, but we take our second paragraph in. After 1833, there was official freedom. In fact, there's official freedom of 800 or over 800,000 people, and anyone who was who was over 6 was an apprentice. Oops. There we go. Right. So people who had been enslaved were no longer called slaves, they were called apprentices. Slaves did not officially exist in the British Empire, and we can use that as an argument to say that slavery did end. Okay, so what I want you to do now is to pause the video, go through the article, and I want you to fill in both sides of this column, including my example. Okay, so I'm going to bounce between the two sides of this table because they tend to kind of come in pairs. So we started off with this idea that people who had been enslaved were no longer slaves, or they weren't called slaves, they were called apprentices. Now there is a counter argument to that. And that's the fact that even though these people were not officially called slaves, they were still essentially slaves. They were just slaves under a different name. So if we go back to this article, I'm referring to this section here. So they had to work for their former masters, and if they didn't do as they were told, they would be violently punished. In fact, they would be violently punished by representatives from the government. I'm not going to talk about this idea of payment, because not being paid doesn't make someone a slave, but it's this idea that these formerly enslaved people had no choice but to be apprentices, and if they didn't do as they were told, then they risked violent punishment, which could ultimately lead to death. Okay, so let's bounce back to our slavery ended completely column. So we then have the fact that the apprentice system was abandoned. It was supposed to last for 6 years. In the end, it only lasted for 5. So it did end. And after that point, those people weren't free. They weren't apprentices. They weren't slaves. However, let's go back to our definition of what makes someone a slave. Someone who is forced to obey someone else without question. So even though these former slaves wouldn't face violent punishment if they didn't work for their former owners, for many of these former slaves, if they were to survive, if they were to have enough to eat, if they were to be able to afford somewhere to stay so that they didn't die out in the cold or the hot, then they probably would need to work for plantation owners, which is this section here. I know I'm going backwards, it's because I'm left-handed. Most high-quality farmland on former slave colonies was owned by plantation owners. Most former slaves had the options of either working on plantations for barely any pay or working poor-quality land. So for many former slaves, they weren't officially called slaves. They weren't being faced with violent punishment if they didn't do as they were told, but if they were to survive, they still had to work on plantations and obey the instructions of their former owners, which a lot of people would still consider slavery. Now, I've also put in this idea of a lack of skills, because for a lot of former slaves, they didn't have an education, which I've included in the reading, and so they didn't really have that many options once they'd been freed. It's really important for us to remember that that is not every single enslaved person, and that there were many very skilled enslaved people, but for a large number of them, they didn't have access to an education. Farm work would have been the main method of income, and they didn't have access to high quality land for themselves, and so they would have probably ended up working on plantations anyway. I don't have any other arguments for slavery ended completely, but I do have one more argument for slavery didn't end at all. And that links into the indirect support for the slave trade in Britain. So even though slaves no longer exist in the British Empire, even though apprentices didn't even exist after, this type of apprentice didn't exist after 1838, slavery still continued in major countries. The USA and Brazil are really good examples of this, and British industry continued to buy products that were made by slaves, and they bought them because they were cheap, and because because Britain was willing to continue buying these products, and slave labour was still used to grow those products. And as I said earlier on, the USA didn't abolish slavery until 1865, and Brazil didn't abolish slavery until 1888. Now, to put that into context, my nan was born in 1918. So in Brazil, in Brazil, slavery wasn't abolished until just 30 years, my lifetime, before my nan was born. That's how close it was, that's how recent it was. Okay, so what I want you to do now is to have a look at my arguments in the table and check yours against them. Make sure that you check and correct in green pen, because you're going to be using all of these arguments. These are essentially mini chains of reasoning. Right, let's go back to our bit of paper that we were working on earlier. So what I want you to do now is I want you to think about this question that we addressed at the beginning of the lesson. To what extent did the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 end slavery? We've already picked it apart, and now I want you to give me your overall opinion. So in history, it's rarely a yes or a no, and that's why we're going to have a look at this spectrum. So I want you to put a line anywhere on the spectrum according to how much you believe this act ended slavery. And then once you put that mark on your line, I want you to explain why you've put it there underneath. Now when you do so, please don't start with "I've put it there because." I would start with "I believe that." So you are answering that question rather than saying "I put the line here." So pause the video, make your mark, fill in this section. Okay, as usual, I'm going to have a little bit of a Blue Peter moment, which I apparently didn't prepare earlier, and I'm going to show you my opinion. I'm not saying that it's wrong if yours is slightly different to mine. I would argue if you're over here and you're saying that slavery, oh dear, actually, I disagree with my own line. I put it around the wrong way. There we go. If you put the line down here, I'm going to disagree with you. If you put the line kind of within this scale, that's absolutely fine. Okay, I believe that while slavery was officially abolished in the British Empire, there were a number of reasons why people in the British Empire could still be considered as slaves, even though they did not technically have that title. Additionally, although many people in Britain supported abolition in other countries, systems existed in Britain which helped slavery to continue to be profitable, there's my first error, and appealing in other countries. So I believe that actually really slavery didn't end that much at all. And I have two big threads that I'm pulling out. Many people were still essentially slaves, even though they didn't have that title, and Britain continued to support slavery in other countries. So this would be my first paragraph. If I was writing a long answer, this would be what at GCSE we refer to as our thesis statement. And after that, I would then unpick these two strands. I'd probably end up unpicking it in 3 paragraphs. Now, that's what you would then use this table for, and what you are going to use this table for. You're going to plan out how you would unpick your opinion, or how you would unpick my opinion. And with each one, you briefly outline your argument. You tell me why that supports your point on the line, why you think it did or it didn't abolish slavery, and then you give me a fact, if you can, that proves that you are right. So, again, I'm going to show you an example. Okay, so apparently I have only done one example. Okay, so my first key argument is people in the British Empire could still be considered slaves even though they didn't officially have the title. That links in really, really closely with that opening paragraph, that opening opinion. Okay, why this supports my overall opinion? Well, as we've defined it, a slave is someone who is forced to obey someone else without question. Many formerly enslaved people had no choice but to continue to work for their former owners, even though they weren't being forced to. And facts that I have that prove me right, well, we've got apprenticeships, which is slavery by another name, because they're being forced to be apprentices, and they face punishment if they don't obey. And even after that point, many former slaves felt... Well, they didn't feel they had to. They had to work on plantations because high quality farmland was not available and they couldn't pull themselves out of the cycle of poverty. So I would probably only pick one of those examples to discuss within this paragraph, but I've essentially done all of the planning. That would be my first paragraph, and then after that one I would have this one, and I would just put this into one paragraph. I'm probably going to use that one as an example, and that would turn into my piece of writing. I would want to add, as an absolute minimum, one further paragraph, and the reason for that is because I need to address both of these points. I need to address this one, and then I need to address this one at the bottom that I've also put in bold. So, what you now need to do is plan out your possible paragraphs. Now, anybody who sends me a written piece of work explaining to what extent the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 ended slavery, I will happily give you a praise point and see if we can get your stuff tweeted up. In order to help you do that, because I'm aware that I may not have done this last time, I'm going to try and write it big enough that you can see. I'm going to run out of space. That's my email address. Send it to me. I will happily give you feedback and a praise point. Okay, thank you very much. Have a lovely day, and I'll see you later.